Hello everyone. I'm Bonnie Lissick and I'm the Auditor General of Ontario. As I table my 2014 annual report, I can't help but reflect on the fact that it's been over a year since my appointment. In that time, we've tabled 2 annual reports, 5 special reports. It's been busy, but it's also been satisfying and rewarding working with the professionals in my office and those in the public and broader public sector, as well as members of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. This year's crop of 12 value for money audits touch on several different themes, all of which I believe are pretty important. For this reason, I'd like to talk about what stood out for us on each audit in the context of these overlapping themes. One key theme is the importance of considering and achieving value for money through planning and revisiting those plans as time evolves and situations change. Let's start with the smart metering initiative. The intent behind implementing smart meters was positive. To implement a system that would enable the province to obtain information about customers' electricity usage patterns and put in place time of use rates that would assist in lowering the use of electricity at peak times, for instance, at dinner time, which would in turn delay the need to construct more power generating facilities. The intent was also to help customers manage their use of electricity to reduce their household bills. Our audit of the smart metering initiative found that although nearly $2 billion of costs paid by ratepayers have been spent on this initiative, the targets of lowering peak demand, reducing the need to bring more generating capacity onto the electricity grid, and lowering overall customer bills are not close to being achieved. The province had not prepared an appropriate cost-benefit analysis when the decision was made in 2004 to implement smart meters. Such an analysis is all the more important when you're on the bleeding edge of implementing new technology. Our message on this is clear. It is important that before such major initiatives are undertaken, proper planning should take place, and those plans should be revisited during implementation to ensure that factors impacting the success of a project continue to be assessed. As yet, value for money for an almost $2 billion ratepayer investment has not been achieved. The challenge on a go-forward basis in a time of surplus electricity is to determine how customer savings through the time of use rates will not be offset by corresponding increases in something that's called the global adjustment component, which now comprises 70% of the time of use rates. Because of the global adjustment, customers are paying more than 3 times the market price for electricity. By 2015, Ontario ratepayers would have paid $50 billion more than the market price of electricity. We encourage the government to ensure that going forward, extensive plans, including cost-benefit studies, be in place and monitored to ensure ratepayers receive value for money on major electricity initiatives. A second area we audited, where planning and revisiting plans is important, was the use of private-public partnerships for infrastructure projects, also known as AFPs. The concept of using AFPs stemmed from budget overruns and delays experienced with many publicly managed infrastructure projects. Infrastructure Ontario has completed many projects on time and on budget using AFPs and has more underway. However, nothing is free, and using AFPs comes with additional costs to taxpayers. For 74 projects where Infrastructure Ontario concluded that private sector project delivery would be more cost-effective, we noted that the tangible costs such as construction, financing, legal services, engineering services, and project management services were estimated to be nearly $8 billion higher than if the projects were contracted out and successfully managed by the public sector. AFPs are often more expensive partly because the private sector pays financing rates higher than government, and ultimately government must pay for this high financing. For the 74 projects, this was estimated at $6.5 billion. What this shows is that if the public sector could manage projects successfully on time and on budget, there is taxpayer money to be saved. With Infrastructure Ontario's growing expertise in managing infrastructure projects, perhaps the risk of the public sector not delivering a project on time and on budget is no longer 5 times higher than having the private sector deliver a project, as Infrastructure Ontario assumes in its calculations justifying the use of AFPs. We also noted that 18 projects should have been assessed to be in total $350 million cheaper under public sector delivery than with delivery under an AFP, because 2 assumptions in Infrastructure Ontario's assessments were inappropriate. We recommended that Infrastructure Ontario revisit both their model and the extent to which AFPs are used, given their experience with large infrastructure projects and the higher cost of AFPs to taxpayers. The second high-level theme this year relates to how government must consider and reduce risk to the public. One example is Infrastructure Ontario's loans program. Although the program makes the majority of its loans to low-risk municipalities, the government amended program regulations to allow for a $260 million loan to a subsidiary of the Mars Discovery District, a not-for-profit organization. There were significant financial risks in providing this loan, compounded by a lack of transparency around the policy objectives and intended benefits of the loan. Defined pension plans in Ontario are another area where the government must take into account the risks faced by many current and future Ontario pensioners. Defined benefit plans continue to be underfunded, meaning they would not have sufficient funds to pay full pensions to their 2.8 million members if they were wound up immediately. At the end of the 2013 calendar year, a staggering 92% of defined benefit plans in Ontario were underfunded. That's up from 74% at the end of 2005. The Financial Service Commission of Ontario oversees these plans, but needs to do more to mitigate the risk. We encourage the Commission to improve its inspections and monitoring of these plans. Risk is also a factor in the area of adult community corrections in the Ontario Parole Board, where the average reoffend rate for adult offenders serving sentences in the community has actually risen over the past decade. We noted that lower risk offenders were often over-supervised, while higher risk offenders were under-supervised. We believe the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services needs to better monitor the work of its probation and parole officers and improve its rehabilitation programs to reduce the risk to the public arising from adult offenders, especially higher risk offenders serving their sentences in the community. The Ministry of Education also needs to take risk into account in its oversight of provincially licensed childcare operators in the province. Between 2009 and 2014, these childcare operators reported more than 29,000 serious occurrences, including abuse of a child, serious injury, a fire, or other physical threat. The Ministry of Education should require that daycare operators obtain vulnerable sector checks for themselves and their staff who work with children, and strengthen its on-site inspection processes and related enforcement actions in order to reduce the number of serious occurrences in licensed daycare facilities. Another area where more frequent inspections would help reduce risk is residential services for people with developmental disabilities. We found that nearly half of these residents have not been inspected since at least 2010. In other residents where inspections were performed, the Ministry of Community and Social Services did not conduct timely follow-ups to ensure that issues identified were resolved. We in Ontario are well aware of the risk associated with contaminated drinking water, given the Walkerton tragedy 14 years ago. The Walkerton Commission of Inquiry recommended the development and implementation of plans to protect source water across the province. Protecting water at its source is safer and more cost-effective than detecting and treating contaminated water. However, at the time of our audit, many areas of the province still did not have approved source water protection plans in place, and the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change did not have a clear time frame for when these plans would be approved. In addition, the ministry still needed a long-term strategy to address funding and oversight of municipalities and conservation authorities to ensure that the plans, once approved, are actually implemented. One more note about considering and addressing risks. We found that while deciding to do nothing may be an option, it is often not the best one. A case in point is the Provincial Nominee Program, which allows Ontario to recommend prospective immigrants to the federal government for admittance to this province as permanent residences. We found that the program encountered applicants and immigration consultants who misrepresented information on their applications or otherwise became aware of potential immigration fraud. But the program never formally reported this information to federal immigration authorities or to law enforcement. This is a threat to the integrity of the program. We also found significant risks that the province might not always be nominating qualified people who can bring economic benefit to Ontario and recommending applicants for immigration to the federal government. Another high-level theme is the need for government to obtain and work with timely and appropriate information. This was highlighted in our audit of palliative care, where the government pays for the services but has insufficient information about them. Specifically, the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care needs to get more information on the services that are available for palliative care costs, patient needs, and what mix of services would best meet those patient needs. This information is essential to the development of an integrated and coordinated system for the delivery of palliative care in Ontario. During our audit of immunization, we noted that the same ministry also lacked complete and reliable information to monitor whether its immunization coverage program and delivery systems operate in a cost-effective manner, and further to the point on risk, whether immunization coverage levels are adequate to prevent a community outbreak. To the point of accurate information, we also found in our audit of the Ontario Energy Board that it needs to perform more validation work on the information provided in rate increases or rate applications from natural gas utilities. A final topic that I would like to comment on is the province's debt. The government has already spoken of its commitment to eliminate by 2017-18 the annual deficit, which is the difference between what the government takes in and what it spends. But we also believe that the government should provide more information on how it plans to reduce the net provincial debt, which is the amount the government borrowed to finance those deficits minus its assets. One key piece of information is the ratio of net debt to gross domestic product. The GDP is the total of all goods and services produced in the province. Calculating debt as a percentage of the GDP provides a good indicator of debt relative to the size of the economy. In essence, the lower the number, the more capability a jurisdiction has to handle its existing debt level. Ontario's net debt to GDP ratio stood at 38.6% at March 31, 2014, up from a pre-recession level of 27%. Among the 10 provinces in the federal government, only Quebec has a higher ratio in the past year. Ontario's net debt for 2017-18 is expected to reach more than $325 billion, or $23,000 for every single man, woman, and child in the province. That's a heavy load, and it could get heavier if interest rates start to rise above their current historical low levels. The cost of repaying the debt and the annual interest each year consumes money that we'd all rather see go to programs that help people directly. We believe the government should provide more information on how it plans to achieve its target of bringing the net debt to GDP ratio back down to pre-recession levels of 27%. Ontarians have a need to know on this vital subject. Our annual report always contains a section on follow-ups that's revisiting audits of 2 years prior to gauge the progress made on our recommendations by ministries, agencies, and the broader public sector. This year we followed up on 77 recommendations from our 2012 report that included 170 actions. I'm pleased to report that 81% of these actions have either been fully implemented or in the process of being implemented. And finally, I want to thank the many people in the public and broader public sectors who were involved in our work for their assistance and their cooperation. I also want to thank my team, that includes my Deputy Auditor General and directors who were here today, for their tireless work this past year. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Gary Peel, my Deputy Auditor General, who will be retiring after 30 years with the office, and Gerard Fitzmaurice, my Director of Education, who also will be retiring after 30 years with the office. And Gary and Gerard, I just want to acknowledge you. There we go. And the legislators, I believe, and the citizens of Ontario have benefited significantly from their work over the many years. And now I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Auditor, on smart meters, we spent double what the government estimated. And you have found that it has not done what the government said it would do, which is namely change our consumption pattern.
Yeah, we found that for the money spent, that there are a number of objectives that have not been met. The reduction of peak demand has not been met, and that was anticipated to be one of the benefits. There was another reduced costs for the distribution companies was another objective that has not been met. In terms of not bringing new generation on the system, that has not been met. And ratepayers' energy bills, the impact of reducing them by having smart meters has not been met.
Would you say then that the program overall is a failure?
We'd say that value for money has not yet been achieved on the investment of $2 billion.
Have they done anything that they said that they would do with this program?
The meters have been installed and the technology is there, but we think that there's still things that need to be done to show that that investment was worth $2 billion. And I think that's something that down the road, people will be looking for.
Based on the figures and the charts you map out, in the near future, it doesn't appear that there will be any savings for Ontarians who try to go with the off-peak usage of electricity. What is it going to take to achieve savings in time of use pricing for people who stay up late to do their laundry and wash their dishes, and they do?
I mean, the global adjustment impacts the TOU rate. 70% of the TOU rate is global adjustment, not the market price of electricity. So at the end of the day, that has to be factored into sort of a relook at the TOU rates. In a time of surplus energy in the province, where the global adjustment is impacting the cost of electricity so much, it's hard. It's going to be hard to achieve savings.
So should they stop some of these global adjustment related contracts? I mean, or is there no hope in achieving lower prices?
That's a policy decision in terms of what the government wants to do on renewable energy, so I can't comment on that. I can just say that what we're recommending they do is on a go-forward basis, when there are major decisions to be made in the electricity industry in Ontario, that there should be solid cost-benefit analysis in place.
But you see no sign in the future that prices are going to come down and that this is going to work without major changes?
At this point in time, I don't have an answer to that. I guess, we are looking, one of our audits that we're looking in the future is power planning, and so we'll be looking to see how the plans on future power supply and demand is going to be achieved, how that's going to factor into all of this.
There are some pretty damning conclusions in this report when it comes to daycare, safety for children, how we're managing and monitoring flu shots and billing them. 20%, they don't even know where those doses went. The smart meters. Overall, what grade are you giving the government this year with your audit?
These are, I'm gonna be fair about it and say that at the end of the day, there's a lot of good things that happen in the public sector. Our role is obviously bringing information to the legislatures and the consumers of what we see as exceptions out there to that. And so, it's unfair to me to apply an overall grade, other than to say, in terms of what we looked at, we think there's a lot of room for improvement in these reports.
But in terms of daycare, you're mentioning some worrying things. Should parents be worried? Are children safe in daycare?
I guess as a parent, I think all of us should do our due diligence in ensuring that the childcare operators that we're entrusting our children to are, in our opinion, good operators. There are lots of good childcare operators out there, but based on our review of the information in the ministry and that, we think there are also operators that are problematic.
Bonnie, why is there such a big hole with some of the checks and balances at daycares? Your report says only 1/3 of new daycare operators are being checked. They're carrying out criminal record checks. What's the big hole in that program? What's the problem?
I think part of it is, well, first of all, there's not enough inspections being conducted. We think there should be more inspections geared to the high-risk operators. We think at the time of licensing that there should be more work done to ensure that all the requirements to be licensed are actually in place. We did see instances where after licensing and the conduct of inspections, there were still things that you would have assumed would have been in place, weren't in place. So we think there just needs to be a focus on those situations and those operators where there are higher risks.
When it comes to the
$8 billion in the $8 billion extra that it costs to build all these public-private infrastructure, compared to doing it through the government, is that $8 billion since 2001, since we started doing this, or is that just in the last 5 years that we could have? I'm just wondering how far back
Yeah.
that.
Well, that we looked at a number of the projects. There's 74 projects that either had been completed or were in process or were in the RFP stage. And so that $8 billion comes from Infrastructure Ontario's own numbers in terms of the actually hard costs associated with having something dealt with by the private sector.
Does that go back? Those 74 projects that go back to 2001?
They go back, I think, to, I'm going to ask my director what year they go back to. 2002? 2005.
And that was, because you found that IO is basically, that their systems seem to be weighted in favor of public-private partnerships when they do these value for money audits. I mean, so is there this kind of myth within the government or within IO that it's always more efficient, essentially, that basically government will always screw up projects, so it's always more efficient to bring in the private sector? Is that kind of a myth that they just don't have any evidence for?
Well, the point in writing the report the way we did is to say, right now, the methodology used in order to make a decision between private sector and public sector assumes that it's 5 times riskier for the public sector to take ownership and build a project or build an infrastructure project. And we're just saying that perhaps should be revisited. There's a lot of expertise that now is built up in Infrastructure Ontario, and perhaps there are some projects that could be conducted inside. A big portion of that $8 billion relates to financing. So, the contractors are using private sector financing, which is at rates higher than what the government's borrowing rate is.
So, Bonnie, do you then reject what IO says that they say about $14 billion in risks of in what they call risks of cost overruns have been taxpayers have been insulated from that by using P3s? Do you reject that because their formula is off?
Well, what we think is that those are estimates that are based on judgment, the $14 billion. And one of the things we pointed out in the report is we think if there is a model that's going to be used on this, it should be based on empirical evidence. So there should be, a swath of projects that failed in the public sector that are used as a basis for determining how much to cost the risk at. So we think there needs to be some more refinement if a model continues to be used.
And also, 74 projects that you're talking about, is that everything that IO has done since 2005?
That would be, they also do smaller projects. So there's a lot of smaller public sector projects that aren't included in here because these ones focused on the ones that were AFP.
So which they are, and they're all, but it's only their AFP ones.
These ones, yes.
The Eglinton and LRT would be on that list?
It would be in here as well, yeah.
when it comes to the Mars loan, after your review, would you say it was a mistake for IO to extend that loan?
I think, to be fair to IO did the right thing. I mean, IO was asking for 80% lease up before that loan was going to be provided out. So they were following their own internal kind of risk assessment of that loan. And how they were able then to lend the money was because they had a guarantee provided by the ministry. And so that's what made it, from IO's perspective, an okay loan to make because the ministry would be guaranteeing it.
Do you think it was a mistake for the ministry to step in and extend that debt service guarantee when they were nowhere near, when Mars was nowhere near that 80% threshold?
There's no doubt there was a financial risk around this. I think at the end of the day, it became a policy decision. And I think, as we say in the report, unfortunately, the policy decision wasn't quite clear in the way this all was structured. But I think that's what it was, the policy decision to support research and innovation. And there is a financial risk as a result of making that choice.
The report calls the lack of policy objectives, gives the perception of bailout of a private sector developer. Do you think that we'll ever see those benefits realized?
Well, we do know that, the private sector developer invested a certain amount of money, and that I think the deal that was on the table is to pay something back to the private sector, but not the full amount of their original investment. So they're not making money on the transaction if it goes, as it goes ahead.
Bonnie, is the common denominator here that a lack of oversight in all the areas we're talking about, you know, we were promised that, you know, these 3 Ps were going to save us money. Didn't. We were told that, you know, these smart meters, it was going to reduce the amount of electricity used, and, you know, we wouldn't have to build other things. It didn't. We're not really benefiting from that. And the theme here seems to be that there's nobody minding the store.
I think each case you have to look at individually. I think in some cases what we see is, there are pretty critical decisions being made, but they're long-term decisions. And when they're long-term decisions, we're saying those ones have to be thought about, pretty, you have to have a plan in place, and you have to have a good cost-benefit study. You have to monitor that, even if it extends, 5 years, 10 years into the future. So that's one kind of message. Around the other areas, the areas of inspections and that, we just think that there needs to be a little bit more attention focused on risk and really targeting resources to the high risk areas. I mean, we're in a time of restraint. I think that something in that area needs to be a message that, if you're going to do some work in a function in a government ministry, that it really has to be dedicated to the areas that'll make a difference.
Since you opened up the deck can of worms, I'll climb into that can. Have you seen anything so far that would suggest the government is going to be able to balance it, eliminate the deficit, balance the books by 2017-18? Have you seen anything that suggests that that's going to happen?
I can't say that we've looked at the government's forecast in the detail that we would need to do to be able to comment on that. I can tell you that the message is out there in the public sector that is the mission and that's what they want to achieve. But from my office's perspective, we haven't looked at the projections to determine whether or not the decisions that are being made will allow them to achieve that or not.
You're talking about reducing debt per capita and all that. Do you see anything that's giving you any optimism that's happening?
Well, I think there's 2 different components, right? So one is reducing the annual deficit and getting to the point where there's a positive bottom line. The other is, even though you do that, if you continue to spend money on infrastructure, your debt still goes up. So there's a second piece there that has to be considered in terms of the level of debt. The other complication to this is the economy, right? So when you look at a level of debt, it's not just how much debt, but it's how well the economy is doing. Because if the economy is doing really good, you can sustain a higher level of debt. So it's a matter of, we say, government needs to put out what their strategy is in terms of how their spending links to spurring the economy so that they can manage whatever level of debt they choose to have at some point in time.
Bonnie, would you say those adults who have developmental disabilities are being overlooked or left behind?
I guess I would say that right now there's a lot of people that are waiting for services, and what needs to happen, or what we think needs to happen, is that there has to be a sense of what the requirements are for the future. Right now, the people that are high priority aren't necessarily the ones to get an accommodation first, because there's a certain mix of residences. So we think what needs to happen is they need to look at the supply of types of residents on a go-forward basis in relation to the waiting list. As well, the funding model hasn't been changed. It's all historical funding. So if you're a group home and you've been funded a certain way, you're going to be funded a certain way the next year. We think they need to look at what the level of people's needs are, what the level of what level of needs a home can provide, and provide funding so that those two mesh.
Auditor, how concerned should we be about the double billing going on in the flu shot situation? And in particular, what was your reaction when you came across this case of that doctor who billed 18 times?
Yeah. I think my team was pretty creative in looking at that database and determining that there were some duplications in billings happening. So we pointed that out to the ministry, and we think that's something the ministry should be doing themselves on a go-forward basis, and follow up with the cases where a physician might be billing twice for the same patient, 3 times, or where the same person might be vaccinated in 2 different locations.
How concerning is this? Is this legal? Is it fraud?
the root cause, we've left with them to figure out and to look into those individual situations. If it is as we say it is here, I think they need to make sure that they've got the necessary controls in their systems to make sure it doesn't happen on a go-forward basis. I mean, there's money attached to that, right?
How do you lose 20% of your flu vaccine?
Right now, there isn't a database that is used to track the ins and outs for vaccines. And so we asked the question, in this case, I think there were 1 million vaccines that they needed to identify for us where they were. And my team was looking for that information, and we didn't get an answer that was satisfactory in terms of what happened to those doses.
So they don't know where 20% of the doses are?
That is correct.
Is that, I mean, that seems like, I mean, if it was a private business, that business would not be in business anymore.
Yeah, we pointed it out, and we think they need to look into this, and they need to put in an inventory control system around this so they do have a handle on the vaccines.
But the province also hands out, not only flu, but they hand out methadone and other drugs that are a lot more serious than that. Do you think we're having the same problem?
I can't comment on that. Our audit focus, you raise a good point. We haven't looked at it. Perhaps that's an area that down the road we should be looking at.
Auditor, on Mars, the debt service obligation that the government had was $7.1 million a year, but the report says that without the leasing requirements filled, next year the debt service obligation was $8 million, and the year after it was almost $15 million. So the government had no choice but to buy the tower, right? Was that what you would conclude?
Well, I don't think the deal obviously hasn't completely finished. I guess the thing is there is value to that building, and I think part of having Infrastructure Ontario involved and having these other individuals that they've chosen to look at the future for the Mars building involved is to determine what the best scenario is for the province. But having said that, our report commented really on the fact that the debt is there and there is a financial risk until all of that is resolved.
But the debt service obligation wasn't enough to cover, unless somehow they could get more tenants in there paying above market rate, which everybody pays right now.
Right.
That debt was not going to be paid off even through the debt service.
I think it is dependent on leasing up that building and having some cash flow coming out of that investment. You're right, or whether the building can be sold. But I think that's up to the government to decide how they're going to handle that. But you raise good points.
And also, it did seem as well that people, when they talk about the money that's been spent on Mars, people haven't been discussing enough the fact that the two public agencies in there are both paying above market rates, which represents even more public money going into Mars than what's been discussed before.
Yeah, there are Public Health Ontario and Cancer Institute for Research are both in there paying, their rates are higher than market. You're right.
Bonnie, I know there's always a political aspect to the things we cover, so we look to you for something a little more objective. The Minister of Energy stood up even as recently as this morning in the House and said that smart meters are working, that smart meters are helping to save people money. Should he continue saying that?
I can't say I caught that this morning, and I didn't catch it, so I don't know.
So hard.
Well, I don't know the context within which he said that, so it would be unfair.
It saves people money, and that is good for Ontarians.
Yeah.
Not just that the meter's going round and round.
Yeah. So rather comment on his comment. I think I'd just say that we think that there needs to be more work done for this project to achieve value for money. I mean, we haven't seen, based on a $2 billion investment, there doesn't seem to be $2 billion of value coming yet.
There's no value in terms of other than having them installed, right? I mean, they're not saving people money, is what you said.
Not at this point in time, based on our work.
So he shouldn't say they are.
I can't comment on what he said or he should have said. Okay. Thanks.
So, Bonnie, you basically have the easiest job in the world.
I do. That's good to know.
Fighting government waste.
Okay.
She acknowledged it.
Yeah, kind of.
I have to say that, part of the difficulty of doing a job is in this sense is obviously, our mandate is to bring to the attention of legislators and citizens information about government and to point out areas for improvement. And we work with the ministries and the broader public sector when we're auditing and we find these issues. So by the time the report comes to the table here, there's a lot of action. To be fair, there's a lot of action happening in the background implementing a lot of these things. And because we're writing on an exception basis, we're not patting a lot of people on the back. But, to be fair, I'm sure there's other things that are happening in the public sector that are good. We're commenting on things that we think there's room for improvement.
Is there one thing, what bothers you the most in this report? What is the biggest concern for you?
It's probably something I haven't been asked about yet. I think the issue, I think sometimes people in the public sector know what the right thing to do is about a situation, but I think, it's like anything, you're cautious and you want to make sure you're doing the right thing, and sometimes when you're so cautious you might not act quickly enough to deal with a situation. So in the chapter that we have here dealing with the immigration program, nominee program, what we encountered is in that particular operation was in our opinion, a misapplication of the Information and Privacy Act, where the ministry came across, or the program came across, a lot of information that we think should have been referred to law enforcement or should have been shared with the federal government or shared with provincial counterparts. And the reason it wasn't shared was because there was a narrow interpretation that if we share things with the police, that we can't do that until there's an investigation underway. So my response was, well, if there's, how would they start an investigation if they didn't have the information that you have? And it took a little while before that was addressed and information was eventually referred over to law enforcement.
In the report,
So what did that
says
translate into? Does that translate to criminals coming into Canada?
Sorry, okay, I will. Does that translate to, you know what, we just think that there's more work to be done ensuring that people that are nominated for this program are meeting the criteria of this program, and that after nominations have occurred and certificates have been issued, that the program does do additional work to make sure that when people are in Canada, that they're working at the jobs they say they're going to be working at, and that the employers that sponsored them or that represented that they have jobs for them are actually valid employers providing a service. Sorry, what was your question?
in the report it says it's over 71% of all nominees that flagged for follow-up has been landed immigrants. So actually, the ministry's lack of a follow-up for those questionable applications. So what results to happen this? Is there's a lack of policy, or it's a lack of resources in the ministry?
I think it was a lack of action, is what I would call it. And I think, by the time they started looking at this again, 71% of those individuals were already landed immigrants.
The ministry, they can't do anything to correct this.
Well, I think what we're recommending is they look at those situations and, if it's possible to rectify it, yes, but if it's possible to learn from it on a go-forward basis, that's even positive, right?
Do you find in the fraudulent applications?
Sorry?
The fraudulent applications,
What was your question, though? I'm sorry.
Since there's a fraud that happened when they apply for the immigration.
I don't have specific numbers. Let me give you one situation where they themselves did a study. They had at one point a program integrity group, and they did a study and they went out to see whether or not people that were nominated for this program were actually employed in the positions they were supposed to be in. And they did find in that case, in that sample, that 38% of those individuals were had potentially misrepresented either themselves or their employers misrepresented the jobs that were there. So there are situations like that.
And also, in the report that there's
I'm sorry?
On the daycare inspections, is there enough money and staff to actually do the work that's needed? Or if we want to have regular inspections in those daycares, we need to hire more inspectors?
Yeah. I mean, we do highlight in the report that the number of daycares in the province, those facilities, has increased more than the level of staff. It really will be up to that people that have responsibility or that function to determine whether those resources are directed to the right areas. We think that the focus should be on high-risk daycares rather than perhaps a uniform approach with all daycares. So that's something they need to look at.
Is that the document, no, the government income and the auditor?
Pardon me?
Government has income, right? Government has income.
Government has income?
Yeah. They have some revenue money in.
From the immigration program? Are you talking? Or?
All over.
Well,
The tax, like
yes.
some facility, they have income.
Yes.
Income is under audit or not?
Oh, you mean, so the government receives revenues from all different sources, taxation and service fees and all that. And so we do the public accounts audit for the province of Ontario. So part of our audit is looking at the completeness of the government's recording of the revenue. Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah.
On it? Yeah, so we signed off on the government statements. 21 years in this province where the governments have obtained clean opinions on the audit. So we're very happy. The government's finances that way are very much in order. Is that, I hope I answered your question. Is that okay? If there's more to it after, I'll be here. You can.
Do you think the provincial nominee program is a failure?
I guess I would say that we think they have a lot to do to improve the program. I do know that as we started auditing, my team was out there auditing in early in the year, and as we came across things, we indicated that we had some concerns, and the ministry, to be fair, they were right on it, and they put in place. They started correcting things. They brought in outside assistance to help them look at the program closer and to put in place measures that will improve upon the operation of the program. I think the intent for that program is to increase the number of provincial nominees handled in Ontario. And so, I do think, to be fair, they are taking measures to improve the program. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
That's
very
good.
much.
Okay,
Yes,
thank
thank
you
you.
very much.